Hey guys, it's Nick. Welcome to another episode of T-365. If you're looking to secure the documentation in your SharePoint environment or the SharePoint environments that you manage across your customers today, stay tuned because I'm going to be giving you the best practice as it relates to the sharing policies that you have at both a global layer and a site layer within SharePoint. And I'm actually going to show you some end user experience demos so you understand how this affects both the internal users to the organization as well as the external users getting those links, and making sure that you don't open up a support nightmare for yourselves with the changes that you can make, because that can happen very quickly. I'm also going to be showing you a third-party tool that I built to help you monitor for these settings across all of your customers called CloudCapsule. That will demo a little bit later as well. If you haven't yet subscribed, go ahead and subscribe to the channel to see more content around Microsoft and the MSP space. Otherwise, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so first I just want to show you CloudCapsule real quick to show how easy it is to view these policies across your customers. You go to cloudcapsule.io and run a free assessment. I'm going to go ahead and sign in here as I'm already signed up. Within the portal, you can add a tenant and consent to the permissions to run an assessment. I've mapped this against the CIS controls so that you can see pass-fail values across IG1 through IG3. Specifically around SharePoint though, we are showing all of the SharePoint sites within the environment here, and you can quickly go under policies to review the SharePoint settings here within the environment, along with a variety of different other policies that span across the various suite offerings from Microsoft. Specifically today though, we're going to be looking at your sharing settings within the SharePoint Admin Center. So this is a quick way to just identify what those sharing settings are and then pivot into a different tenant. So definitely check out CloudCapsule, run a free assessment, and let me know what you think. Okay, so getting into it here, when we talk about security in SharePoint, we have kind of a layered approach here, but as Microsoft's architected this, you almost need a PhD level education to get into securing SharePoint over time, especially as it relates to permissions and access as they cascade down through many layers, as we'll see here in a few minutes. I'm going to be doing more videos on this because there's certainly a lot to unpack and it's a lot for just one video, but we have a lot of considerations here when we talk about security in SharePoint, first of which is our sharing links that we're going to be talking about today in depth for the settings that we have within our portal. We also just have our basic architecture that we have for our SharePoint environment, considerations as far as public versus private sites, how we're organizing our document libraries, how we're measuring that against the departments or sensitivity of those documents within the organization. We also have access controls, which also depend on if you're still using kind of the classic site architecture to add individual users to be part of those sites versus if you're using a more modern approach with 365 groups, maybe dynamic groups, to add and remove users after they have moved departments or onboarded or offboarded to the organization. We also have considerations for sensitivity labels. And that's more of our data taxonomy consideration, data governance. We have considerations for our document lifecycle, which relate to archiving in a lot of cases for the things that we're looking at. How do we manage the lifecycle of our documents as a whole? And that also can spurt into retention and retention policies that we do have. And then at a more advanced layer, we also have kind of expanding off of access controls. We have the ability to create granularity for unmanaged devices, as well as some considerations for conditional access policies at a granular site layer. So a lot to unpack there, and fundamentally I'll be getting through this in multiple videos here that we're going to be going through over the next few weeks or so. But essentially here we're going to drill into the sharing links that we have within SharePoint Online as well, just to get into some of the considerations for those default settings, because I believe this is your tier 0 level protections that you're trying to push out to your customers. As we drill into the actual sharing policy and settings, you have to keep in mind here that we have a cascading structure as far as permission sets go. So what I'm going to be showing you today is really modifying the global settings that we have for our entire SharePoint environment, which again extends to OneDrive. But across your global settings, you could also get more granular across individual sites within your environment here. And then within your individual sites, you also have document libraries one-to-many, that you may be instituting within your environment, which you can set individual permissions on as well there. And then within those individual sites, you can also set individual permissions at the document layer as well too. So it's important to understand that these permissions are kind of cascading down, and you can get more granular across the board depending on if you need to set up more granular settings, which is to say, if we keep things open up here at our global settings, we can lock them down to maybe internal users only at particular sites or document libraries, or even the documents themselves. So it's important to keep that in mind as far as the cascading structure, but that also makes things a little bit harder to understand or manage from an administrative standpoint. We're going to be unpacking these settings today just so you understand a little bit more about what's going on, but also that end user impact as well too. So when we think about an individual user sharing a link out, that user, if you've gone through this flow, you already know what this looks like, but they automatically get this dialog here that the link has been copied. Whenever they say copy link, and by default, it's going to capture the global settings that we've set across the tenant. So we have some considerations there as far as what's set, but this is why it's so important that we monitor what this is. In my opinion, these aren't secure by default, so we want to be able to modify them. So when we talk about the link settings and the permissions that we have, by default, the link setting is set for anyone. And so this is why I think it's not secure by default, because when you click on this link is going to be public, and it can be shared with anybody. Meaning you don't have to authenticate your identity in order to get access to that link, and anybody who has access in general can click on that and open the document. So this is restrictive, and again, you can think about the worst case scenario of a financial document, a source of IP, an HR document that has sensitive data going out from somebody and somebody copying it and just having an anyone link. It's very eye-opening to kind of do an audit log trail within Microsoft and see the anyone links generated across documents, understanding that they might have some sensitive data. The next setting that we have here, that is the next setting down, is new and existing guest. So this is more restrictive, but it can also be disruptive as well, create support cases. We'll get into more of why that is here in a minute. But this is basically saying, I need an authenticated user to access this document, and I also want this user to specify who do they want to share with in general. So it's not just an anyone link. They have to actually type in an email address here, whether that's internal or external, to have this kind of be an authenticated user. Otherwise, they would just use the setting that says people within my organization, right? From the standpoint of the sharing link itself. But this is really big because when we think about this workflow, there's a lot of heavy considerations for the support burden that this might cause. So if we think about this in two different contexts, we have the context here where we're sharing this with a guest user. Let's say it's a guest in general, but that guest is in an environment that also uses Microsoft 365. So if they're using Microsoft 365, they're going to get a link and it's going to prompt them to go ahead and say, why don't you go ahead and sign in? And then once they sign in, it's going to have them consent, depending on the settings that I'll show you here in a minute, that says we can read your profile, we can track your history as it relates to your interaction with this document, and they can say okay to that. And then the other major consideration that we have to take in mind, though, is that you have a conditional access policy that's set up to enforce MFA within the tenant. They're also going to be prompted to set up MFA, and not just if they already have it in their organization set up, they're actually going to be prompted to set it up within your organizational context, meaning a different MFA method. So when I say that, if they have, let's say, Authenticator set up in their organization, they have already set up MFA, and they come in, they try to sign in, they're actually going to be needing to set up Authenticator, if you've got that enforced as your default method for MFA, within the guest context here as well. So whenever they do this and they consent here, they actually get added to your Active Directory in Entra as an external user. And I'll show you this in the demo here as well, but then they're basically an authenticated, approved user, for that particular document. But this is big to me because let's say they have MFA set up in their other account and they use SMS, they don't use Authenticator. They now have to walk through a workflow. Maybe you only approve Authenticator. They have to go and set that up. It's a heavy impact potentially to them. And they also have to jump through these 3 hoops, right, in order to just access the document. So it can be pretty disruptive to a workflow, and it could cause a support case to come through you as well too. The other consideration here for the guest is, let's say they're not in Microsoft, and the most common example I can give to that here is going through Gmail or sending it to a Gmail user, but you could really put in any other third party. They could be using Google, but they could also just be using a Yahoo account or anything else like that, as long as they're not in the Microsoft context. And this workflow is even more disruptive to me because they still, when they go in there, they still get this sign in prompt. And it's very confusing. You'll see that in the demo, but it's basically asking them to sign in to Microsoft. And it's confusing to me because it interprets, or the user would interpret that as that I don't have a Microsoft account. I don't know how to sign in, and they would just stop there and not move forward. But if you actually put your email into there and you don't have a live account or a Microsoft account, 365 in general, they could actually, go ahead and just get a prompt or say, I want to enter a code. And that code would be emailed to them at their Gmail account. They would enter that code. And again, they would still have to go through the MFA prompt if you've set up conditional access policy to apply it. And this is even further in the sense of a degraded end user experience because they're in a whole different ecosystem. They might not use an authenticator app. They may be using Google Authenticator or whatnot. So you may also have a lot of heavy support burden from this as well too. But the basic benefit obviously to this is that we're only approving authenticated users within our environment, and we're enforcing additional protections like multi-factor authentication. So there is a lot of security benefit here, but if you think about the support burden, that comes with that, that's pretty high from what we can do. So I'm going to get into some additional considerations with that, but I want to cover the additional 2 types of sharing policies that you can set within there for the default settings. So the next one here is just existing guest. So this is even more restrictive because we're basically saying that every user by default can't just invite anybody anymore, whether they're internal or external. They can only, add people who are already approved as approved third parties or communicators within the business. So generally speaking, you would have to have an admin basically control who's a guest user within the organization, or from a sense of role-based access, you also have the guest inviter role. That could be leveraged here as well too to invite new guests. But this is even more restrictive obviously because those guest users have to exist. You would have to have a process behind when a user doesn't exist that I need to share a document with. What do I do? And again, that's a heavy administrative burden. And the last setting here that is the most restrictive is to only share with internal users. So that's if you were saying, I don't want to approve anything going outside the organization. This is most commonly never going to be a setting that you would set within an SMB. And in fact, when we take a look at all of these, just from what we covered here in the sense of the support burden, I would argue that in most cases, you're never going to get into the use case of this or this for SMB. I think it's just too hard to manage. You may be able to get into new and existing guests, but again, you have to deal with this clunky user experience. In most cases, you're going to leave the anyone set here just because it's so disruptive to do anything else. So it's important to take note of this, but also important to take the context that we have a couple of layers that we can work with here outside of these settings, so it's a recommendation. So when we talk about that and we talk about our additional settings here, We also have some considerations for, the default link that's presented in this user flow where they say, we automatically copied the link. And by default, it's again got to be set to anyone. But you can change that, and that's the setting that I typically recommend that we change here, which is to say that we require that the user specify specific people. And so when we do this, we're effectively channeling the user. They could still go back retroactively and click on the settings of this link and say, yeah, I actually want to share it with anybody or want it to be an anyone link. But it's more beneficial if they actually specify the people that they want, so it's just not a public link that's out there in the wild after they were to share it out. The other major consideration here that we have for this is just the permissions. And so again, the default permission here that's going to be set is going to be edit in this case. So by default, that setting when they generate that link is going to say that you can edit this document. And in a lot of cases, we want a green light just viewing the document here. So it's just saying you can view it. You could technically, edit this again as well too as you're sharing it. But if somebody wants to co-author the document, they would share it in an edit permission. But by default, it would be set to view because we want to promote a model of least privilege and we want the user to be cognizant of sharing that out. Now, if you think about that workflow, if a user just takes the link by default blindly and we've got it set up for specific people and view-only access, but they want to co-author that document with the user that they're sharing for, most likely what's going to happen is that the user that they shared with is going to say, I can't edit this document, let me save a copy. And they're going to save a copy locally on their device. And then the users are going to end up editing two different documents and there's going to be this like, oh crap, I haven't updated the right document, right? And you get into that kind of bad user workflow, bad user experience. So it's very important, I think, when you talk about these settings in general and the global settings overall, depending on how you set them, that there's kind of a training experience that happens with the user that says, this is best practice, this is how you should share documents, this is what you want to do if you're co-authoring with different users within your organization or external to the organization as well. Remember, we want to tighten things down both internally and externally while not wildly impacting end users, which is where even these settings get into that as well too with the actual permissions that we're setting on those links. So overall here, my recommendations or what I think is realistic based off of the environments that I've set up is that you do kind of have to keep this anyone setting within the tenant. This is a lot more restrictive, can cause a lot more support issues. You'd like to go achieve this, but I don't think it's realistic to be able to do that immediately. I think you need that training for the end user experience, and you also have to supplement them with enablement content to know when I do share this to external users, they're going to actually see this experience. And I want to make sure that they are privy to understanding how to answer questions, or at least send them some type of supplemental documentation to say, I shared this copy of this link with you. This is what you're going to see in order to be able to access it due to the security settings that our administrators have set up within our tenant. And then again, what I would also do from a holistic evaluation perspective is say, yes, we do have any one link set up at the global setting. We've specified these additional granular settings so that we have lesser of a propensity for people to be using them and more of a propensity for people to be specifying certain individuals and having only view rights versus edit capabilities. But then at the individual site layer, we can additionally lock things down just so that if we do have something like a finance site here that has a bunch of sensitive documents or things like that, we can actually lock this down so that it's only using maybe the internal users to our organization, and we just have that entire document repository, if you will, locked down so that users can't share that externally, and we have those protections there. And that actually gets into best practice where it's not so disruptive when we talk about these other workflows here, and I think that's the key balance, because you can easily start to make people really angry with these types of workflows. This is why I wanted to call it out. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into some demos so I can show you this user experience. You can see what that looks like for both Microsoft users and third-party users like a Gmail account. So we're going to start here in the sharing section under policies within the SharePoint Admin Center. These are the major global settings that you can configure that, again, I think are not secure by default, or at least not adhering to some best practices as it relates to a model of least privilege. So within here, you're going to have these set to anyone by default here whenever you set up a tenant. And by default, the generated link that gets set is the anyone link, and they have edit capabilities. So this, what you see selected here, is more my preferences of what you would like to get to. Again, I think most people have to start out at anyone and move into this over time, just because of the disruption and problems that could cause without end user training. I've never liked this nomenclature in here. I feel like maybe it's just me, but it's a little bit counterintuitive to what you would think. But at the end of the day, this is the most unrestricted setting that you can have, and this is the most restrictive. So permissive is just, I get the term itself, but to me, it seems counterintuitive when you first look at that. It's kind of confusing, I think, to the regular user. But regardless, this is the settings that I just covered there in the demo, or the whiteboarding exercise that we just did there. But effectively, after you set these and save this takes effect in a couple of minutes, and we'll show you the end user experience in a few minutes there as well. But some of these other additional granular settings I like to modify. These first two here, I think, are unfeasible on 99.9% of tenants. And this is because it's at a global layer, number one, so it cascades down to all sites, all document libraries, things like that. But to limit external sharing by a certain domain or certain domains is pretty hard. That's a recommendation from Microsoft, and that's a recommendation from CIS even, but I just don't see how that's tenable with the administrative overhead that would cause and the disruption it would cause to end users. Same thing with only users in specific security groups. I've never been able to institute this, although you would love to have just certain users who can share externally. Depends on the business case, but I've never found that to be something that you could implement, at least at the global layer here. Guests must sign in using the same account which invitations are sent. This is a setting I like to tick on. That's off by default. And this is basically to say they can't just sign in with a different account to the invitation link that you send out. So if you send it out to nickross@gmail.com, they can't sign in to the tradingnest@gmail.com as far as the specificity goes. This option is turned on by default, which is to allow guests to share items they don't own. That's the one I like to untick, just because the owners of those documents internal to your organization should be the ones to dictate that setting. And then these last two settings here I like to take on as well too, which is that you have an expiration date basically that's ticking for the users outside the organization that have access to these documents. And I like to set it at 60 days for most organizations. Depending on the business use case, you might extend that, you might make it more restrictive, maybe 30 days. But generally speaking, 60 days is long enough for them to do what they need to do with the document and not have to access it again. But again, it depends, right, on the use case. What would happen in those use cases as well is that guest user trying to access that document after 60 days, the link that they click on would say, this document's no longer being shared with you. Go ahead and request, another link from the user if you need access, something along those lines. And so they would just have to reach out. So it's a little disruptive, obviously, to the user, and they have to reshare. It's kind of an inconvenience, but the frequency of which that should happen should be lower. And the protections that you get with the expiration, I think, are warranted. People who use the verification code, we'll see this here in a minute with the user experience, mostly going to happen with our G Suite users, third-party users who are authenticating that don't have a Microsoft account with a verification code in their email. But again, this is another one just for a model of least privilege to have them re-authenticate. Again, depending on the business use case, if you have an organization that communicates with a bunch of Gmail users or third parties that don't have Microsoft accounts, may want to bump this one up just because that would get really disruptive. And then like I mentioned here, file and folder links by anyone, it's set to the anyone link. So it's publicly available link, and that link that's being able to copied. You want to have specific people that the user specifies here for this, just to generally say it's a model of least privilege, and you want them to have those viewing rights versus edit capabilities. Again, I think it's important to do the training behind this so that users don't come to you and say, I don't get it. Every document I share, the other user can't edit it. We have to go through this exercise of really trying to join a document together and sharing on a new one. So it's definitely something that you want to train them up on so they know how to modify that if they are looking to co-author. And then the last settings here, I usually leave ticked on too. A lot of it's for reporting. And then the other one here is to use short links for sharing files and folders. I like to do that. It's usually a better user experience, kind of obfuscates the 400 characters you might get from generating a link. This is less of a concern though now these days, just given that a lot of cases you're sharing through Outlook, most likely for these links, at least externally. And with this, they're actually condensing that down into just a title as a deep link automatically for you within that experience. So less of a concern, but just better in general there. The other thing there, when we talk about, the nesting structure, when you have the global admin settings, maybe again, you have your anyone link set up here, you can go into the active site section and you can actually modify the sites themselves directly here. And so if I was to click on one of these sites here that I have outside of what I'm looking at, I can go under the settings tab and you have your external file sharing settings here that you can list. And as you can see, you can make this one, it inherits that global policy, and you can't select anyone because we've set that as the global layer. But if we did, that would be what it would inherit, which you could say that I only want people in my organization to be able to share documents from this particular site. And then down below here, it's like you can override the existing settings at the global layer, and you can specify other particular granular settings for this particular site, and that keeps cascading down, right? You can do that even more granular at the document repository layer and the document layer, but this is how I would institute this, given that you're going to have some of these settings here that you really want to go ahead and lock down even further, like that finance site, right, that we want to lock down within our organization, that just should be only shared with internal users and subsequently maybe just a couple departments or groups within our organization as well. Okay, so now let's see the end user experience on both the individual sharing a link and the individual receiving that link with both a Microsoft account and a non-Microsoft account. So I'm in a SharePoint environment document repository with some documents that I want to share out. And again, this could be SharePoint, it could be the Microsoft OneDrive environment for the user. It doesn't really matter. In these cases, you're still going to get that depending on how you modify the global settings. But if I go ahead and copy the link here, it's going to default this to people with existing access can use the link. So if you go into the settings here, you can modify it to just internal users of CloudCapsule if you really wanted to, or you could specify people you choose, right? And so you notice also here that my more settings is set to can view instead of can edit, but I can modify that policy as well. So if I wanted to go ahead and type in a name, I can type in the Microsoft account first and foremost here. I'm in CloudCapsule, I want to share it with somebody in the T- directory. So if I type that out, they're not going to be found in my directory, and it's just going to have them highlighted here as a new email. This could get fat fingered and they could put in the wrong email address just as a call out here, but it does give them the disclaimer that T- is outside your organization. I could set an expiration date outside of the global policy of that 60 days if I really wanted to as a user here. You also notice that anyone is grayed out from the settings that I performed. I'm going to go ahead and apply here and create this link. Now I'm going to go ahead and share this with my third-party MSP for MSPs, and let's see what their experience looks like. Okay, so I got the link here. I've clicked on it as MSPs for MSPs, and we get this little message here from Microsoft. Click on next. It's going to ask us to sign in here. I'm going to go ahead and sign in with my account. And then this is where we get our consent workflow. And this is basically saying that, it can read our profile data. It's going to track our activity as it relates to, the access that we have within CloudCapsule, so that it can be recorded in the audit log and specifically around this document, obviously, right, too. So I'm going to go ahead and accept this here. And then this is the key thing that we have to take in mind here, right? Again, if you have a conditional access policy that's applied to all users within the organization, excluding some break glass accounts, this is going to affect your guest users as well too. So we can click on next here to walk through the MFA workflow, and it'll take you through the Microsoft Authenticator app workflow if you've got that set up by default. And you'll have to download Authenticator if you don't already have it. Maybe your third-party Microsoft or sorry, maybe your external parties using Microsoft 365, but they're enforcing SMS. So what I talked about here, now they're going to have to download Authenticator, which creates these barriers here. You could obviously exclude guest users from your MFA policy. Not a best practice, but another way that you could avoid them having to register here. Back in the Entra portal, you will also notice that you have, if I have my users here and I go ahead and refresh this, you now have this guest user here that was, external Azure AD user. I haven't changed this one to Entra yet, right? But the creation type was invitation, that we got here as well, and they're a guest within our organization. So this is, again, another area where you kind of have another consideration here, which is that this could quickly proliferate over time quite heavily within your account. So you'd want to make sure you measured kind of the access that these guests have over time, and then clean up the directory from users that haven't signed into your directory maybe within the past 45 days, 60 days, something like that, just to keep your directory clean. Moving back into sharing, let's move to a third-party email now too, just to see that experience. And let's just use a Gmail account here. So I'm going to go ahead and say copy the link. I'm going to click into the settings. I'm going to change this to people you choose. I'm going to type out this email address. So I'm going to go ahead and select this. This is a Gmail account. I'm going to click on apply. Now let's see what this user's experience is like. Okay, so for this user, they have the same kind of flow here at the beginning where they're getting a secure link, they get the same prompt, it's telling them their email address. This is where things begin to break down for me though. This is, in my opinion, a full stop for that user if they don't have a Microsoft account. They're going to say, I don't have a Microsoft account, I can't log in, and it's going to be a support case to you. But really, all they have to do here is type in their email address as in the Gmail account and click on next. And then it goes ahead and it says, hey, we'll send you a code to this. In some cases, it will also just ask for a password and then it said use a code instead. Just want to call that out as far as a potential workflow. So we'll click on send code here. And then it'll have a prompt for them to go ahead and enter that. In their Gmail account, they'll have this email here. This is a single digit code. It's one-time use. You can go ahead and copy that. And I'll go ahead and paste it in here and click on sign in. It's going to ask me if I want to stay signed in. And then it will go through our consent workflow. This is what's going to add this user into our directory. And then we get our MFA flow. So again, I think this is really disruptive just because it's not really intuitive for the users who don't have a Microsoft account, who's using Gmail. They walk through that code flow and it's just highly confusing. So definitely be aware of that as you begin to roll this out, just so you understand what that looks like. Okay guys, so that's everything I had for you today. Definitely comment below with any questions you had about these sharing settings. Stay tuned for more around this topic, just that layered security approach to security in SharePoint that I talked about. Like and subscribe to see more of that content in the future. And as always, have a great week guys. I'll see you next week.